The search for Nancy Guthrie has reached a somber milestone as the investigation enters its 48th day with more questions than answers. Authorities have shifted their focus toward the sprawling construction sites and industrial landfills surrounding the Pima County area, a move that signals a desperate search for physical evidence that may have been discarded in the wake of her disappearance. Investigators are now meticulously retracing the logistics of local contractors, attempting to map out the exact movement of debris from the neighborhood to various dumping grounds. This phase of the operation is described by experts as an architectural nightmare, requiring a grid-based forensic recovery effort that involves sifting through tons of compacted waste. The goal is to identify specific containers that were present in the vicinity of the Guthrie residence during the critical window of the abduction. Because construction debris is often processed and leveled by heavy machinery, the structural integrity of any potential evidence is at extreme risk. Forensic teams are not necessarily looking for a biological recovery at these sites, but rather the missing pieces of a struggle: tools, contaminated materials, or organic matter that might have been commingled with household and industrial refuse. The complexity is compounded by the fact that these landfills operate on a strict chronological grid. If investigators can pinpoint the date of a specific pickup, they can isolate a geographic zone within the dump. But the aerobic environment of such sites means that any organic evidence is rapidly degrading under the desert sun. Simultaneously, the narrative surrounding the case has been muddied by a surge of speculative theories from the public, most notably the suggestion that the target was not Nancy herself, but rather her high-profile daughter, Savannah. Rumors of a persistent stalker have dominated social media circles, leading to a wave of amateur detective work that local law enforcement is now forced to address. Independent investigators and behavioral analysts remain highly skeptical of this angle, noting that the mechanics of the crime do not align with the typical behavioral patterns of a fixated harasser. Stalkers generally seek direct proximity or a reaction from their primary target. The abduction of an elderly relative from a remote desert home represents a radical departure from known psychological profiles in such cases. The prevailing sentiment among veteran detectives is that these theories serve only to clog emergency tip lines and divert resources away from the forensic realities of the porch and the construction leads. There is a growing frustration that the fantastical nature of the stalker narrative is a distraction from what appears to be a cold, calculated, and localized act of violence. While the FBI's behavioral units continue to vet every lead, the focus remains firmly on the physical evidence left behind at the scene, which tells a far more grounded and grimmer story than the online rumors suggest. A forensic analysis of the Guthrie porch has provided the most chilling insights into the moments Nancy was taken. High-resolution imagery of the blood patterns suggests a passive deposition rather than a high-velocity struggle. Experts examining the droplets note that the blood appears to have fallen from a height of approximately 3 to 4 feet, impacting the ceramic tile and gravel in a linear fashion. This indicates that Nancy was likely being moved or carried while actively bleeding, with the fluid falling straight down to the earth due to gravity. There is a distinct absence of projected spatter, the kind of spray associated with a violent strike, and instead the scene is defined by expirated blood. This suggests the presence of internal trauma, perhaps to the nose or mouth, where the blood was mixed with air before being coughed or sneezed out. The discovery of tiny white vacuoles within the larger droplets confirms that the blood was aerated, a classic sign of nasopharyngeal trauma. This detail is crucial because it helps reconstruct the victim's physical state during the abduction. She was alive, she was upright or being supported, and she was struggling to breathe through an injury that was issuing a significant volume of fluid onto the walkway. However, the integrity of this physical evidence has been severely compromised by a massive failure in scene security. In the chaotic 48 hours following the initial report, the perimeter of the Guthrie home was not properly maintained. The public and the media were allowed nearly unfettered access to the very porch where the blood was deposited. Footage has surfaced showing delivery drivers and journalists walking directly over the areas of interest, potentially kicking gravel over the blood droplets and destroying the chain of custody required for a successful prosecution. This lack of security means that the distribution of rocks and foliage found on top of the blood can no longer be used to determine the direction of the suspect's movement. What could have been a definitive map of how Nancy was maneuvered out of her home is now a contaminated mess of footprints and environmental disturbance. The frustration among the investigative community is palpable, as the window to capture pristine tool marks on the supposedly impenetrable security door has also likely closed. While the door itself showed no obvious signs of a forced entry via pry bar, the possibility of a sophisticated lockpick remains, but the sheer volume of foot traffic at the scene has made it nearly impossible to isolate the suspect's specific forensic signature from the noise of the crowd. The focus has now shifted to the sophisticated molecular hunt for a suspect through the lens of genetic genealogy. While the Pima County Sheriff's Department has faced heavy criticism for the initial handling of the physical crime scene, the biological evidence recovered from within the Guthrie home remains the most potent weapon in the investigation. This stranger DNA, which does not match Nancy, her family, or any of the documented contractors who had recently worked on the property, is currently being subjected to exhaustive laboratory analysis. Forensic DNA consultants and former criminalists from major urban labs are weighing in on the complexities of this process, noting that the primary hurdle is not the technology itself, but the nature of the sample. In many high-stakes abductions, investigators are forced to work with complex mixtures, biological samples containing the genetic material of 3 or 4 different individuals. To perform successful genetic genealogy, technicians must first isolate a clean, singular profile of the unknown contributor. This is a delicate, time-consuming endeavor that involves breaking down the sample to its core components to ensure the resulting data is suitable for upload into public and private genealogical databases. Once a viable profile is established, the investigation enters the realm of tree building, a digital dragnet that relies on the participation of the general population in DNA registries. The effectiveness of this technique is inherently tied to the diversity and volume of the available data. For example, if the suspect belongs to a specific demographic group that is underrepresented in these databases, the search can hit a wall. However, recent successes in high-profile cold cases have demonstrated that even a distant cousin's DNA can provide the anchor point needed for a team of expert genealogists to trace a family lineage back to a specific individual. In the Guthrie case, the hope is that a breakthrough in the lab will provide a name or a bloodline that links back to the white vehicle spotted in the maze of streets surrounding the home. This digital pursuit is happening in the background of a much louder public discourse regarding the missing woman's safety as the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit continues to scrutinize every piece of communication that has emerged since day one, looking for any hint of the suspect's identity or geographic origin. Central to this psychological profile is the evaluation of a purported ransom note that surfaced via a prominent media outlet. The letter, which contains specific deadlines and demands for Bitcoin payment, was initially treated with the utmost gravity by both the Guthrie family and federal authorities. Savannah Guthrie's public pleas, stating that the family was listening and ready to pay any price for her mother's safe return, reflected a desperate willingness to negotiate. However, as the investigation has crossed the 40-day mark, the legitimacy of this ransom demand has been cast into serious doubt by kidnapping and ransom experts. Authentic kidnapping cases almost always include 2 non-negotiable elements: proprietary information known only to the perpetrator and proof of life. In this instance, neither was provided. The fact that the note was sent to a news organization rather than directly to the family is a massive red flag for investigators, suggesting that the ransom may have been a cruel hoax perpetrated by an opportunist looking to exploit the media frenzy surrounding the disappearance. Furthermore, the timing of the demand does not align with the logistics of a professional kidnapping for profit. Typically, a ransom request is issued immediately following an abduction to maximize the pressure on the family and initiate negotiations before the trail goes cold. In the Guthrie case, the delay in communication and the lack of a direct line of contact suggest that the primary motive may not have been financial. Analysts argue that a burglary gone wrong rarely results in a kidnapping, as intruders typically flee the moment they encounter a resident. If Nancy was targeted, it was likely an intentional act rather than a spontaneous decision made during a robbery. The absence of any negotiation following Savannah's public offer to pay suggests that the individual or individuals involved were either unable to provide proof of life or were never interested in the money to begin with. This realization has shifted the investigative momentum back toward the forensic trail on the porch and the possibility that the answer lies in the local construction crews, who had intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's layout and the perceived invulnerability of the Guthrie home. The investigative spotlight has intensified on the construction personnel who had direct access to the Guthrie neighborhood in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. While the public remains captivated by the specter of a high-profile stalker, seasoned criminalists are more concerned with the insider knowledge required to bypass the security measures of the home. The neighborhood, described by residents as a fortified enclave, was equipped with top-tier security doors that many claimed were impenetrable. Yet the lack of shattered glass or structural damage to the primary entry points suggests a level of surgical precision. If a lockpick was indeed utilized, it indicates a perpetrator who is comfortable spending several minutes exposed on a front porch, a behavior that points towards someone who felt they belonged in the environment. This is why the FBI has moved from simple questioning to a more aggressive forensic audit of work logs and subcontractor schedules. Every person who set foot on a nearby job site is being cross-referenced against the stranger DNA found inside the residence, as investigators look for a crossover between physical presence and biological evidence. This focus on the construction crews is also driving the grueling search of local dump sites, where the sheer volume of material presents a daunting challenge for recovery teams. Each grid of the landfill represents a specific window of time, and detectives are hunting for any item that seems out of place: discarded clothing, cleaning supplies, or even the foliage that was reportedly used by the suspect to obscure their movements. There is a growing theory among forensic analysts that the perpetrator may have used the chaos of a nearby construction project to mask the noise of the abduction. In a neighborhood filled with the sound of heavy machinery, power tools, and transport trucks, a struggle or a scream could easily be drowned out. The white vehicle seen navigating the maze of streets during the critical hour is now being analyzed not just as a getaway car, but potentially as a specialized work vehicle that would not have drawn suspicion from neighbors or passing patrols. As the search continues, the psychological toll on the Guthrie family has reached a breaking point, exacerbated by the silence that followed the expiration of the alleged ransom deadlines. The initial hope that the Bitcoin demand was a legitimate path to Nancy's return has withered, replaced by the grim realization that the note may have been a tactical diversion. Behavioral experts argue that if the abduction were truly motivated by profit, the captors would have provided a proof of life to ensure the family remained engaged. Without such proof, the investigation must pivot back to the most violent interpretation of the forensic evidence, the significant blood loss on the porch, and the expirated droplets that suggest a victim in severe physical distress. The presence of aerated blood near the doorway remains the most haunting piece of the puzzle, as it implies that the struggle was not just a brief encounter, but a sustained trauma that occurred before Nancy was even moved toward the driveway. Compounding this tragedy is the legal reality that the contaminated crime scene may have already sabotaged a future trial. The fact that the porch was not secured, allowing environmental factors and human interference to compromise the linear fashion of the blood trail, means a defense attorney could easily argue that any evidence found there is circumstantial at best. The chain of custody is the backbone of any criminal prosecution, and in this case, that chain was broken the moment the scene was released to the public. If a suspect is eventually identified through genetic genealogy, the prosecution will be forced to rely almost entirely on the DNA found inside the home, as the outdoor evidence has been rendered legally noisy. This has created a race against time for the DNA consultants, who are working under the immense pressure of a 48-day-old cold trail, knowing that every hour that passes makes the recovery of Nancy Guthrie less a matter of rescue and more a quest for finality and justice. The final phase of the Nancy Guthrie investigation has transitioned into a high-stakes forensic waiting game as the world watches the Pima County Sheriff's Department grapple with the fallout of their initial procedural errors. With the 48th day drawing to a close, the focus has narrowed to the cutting-edge intersection of genetic genealogy and the digital footprints left by the white vehicle seen stalking the periphery of the Guthrie estate. Investigators are now poring over hundreds of hours of residential and commercial surveillance footage, attempting to identify a license plate or a unique modification that could link a specific individual to the maze of streets on the night of the disappearance. The FBI's cellular analysis survey team is simultaneously working to isolate every mobile device that pinged local towers during the critical window, looking for a digital ghost, a device that was present but perhaps went dark at the exact moment the abduction began. This technical dragnet is the only way to bypass the contaminated physical scene and find the person who managed to navigate a burglar-proof security door without leaving a trace of forced entry. The biological evidence remains the linchpin of the entire case, as the DNA crime scene consultants push the limits of current technology to build a family tree for the stranger whose genetic signature was left inside the home. Every person who was on a construction crew, every DoorDash driver who approached the porch, and every family associate has been systematically excluded, leaving behind a profile of a ghost. The hope is that this individual is already in a database or has a relative whose recent upload to a genealogical site will trigger a match. This process, while revolutionary, is fraught with additional hurdles depending on the ethnic background of the suspect and the density of the existing records. If the perpetrator belongs to a population with low database participation, the search could take months or even a year, a timeline that is unacceptable to a grieving family and an anxious public. There is a palpable sense of urgency to identify this individual before the trail in the construction dump sites is completely obliterated by the natural decomposition and compaction of the desert landscape. Meanwhile, the narrative of the Savannah Guthrie stalker has been largely dismantled by behavioral experts who argue that the crime was far too methodical to be the work of a fixated fan. Instead, the evidence points toward a localized threat, someone who understood the rhythms of the Guthrie household and the specific vulnerabilities of Nancy's daily routine. The expirated blood on the porch, showing that Nancy was in respiratory distress, remains the most damning piece of physical reality in a case otherwise filled with speculation. It suggests a level of violence that contradicts the idea of a simple ransom-for-profit scheme. As the $1.2 million reward remains unclaimed and the ransom deadlines pass into history, the investigative theory has shifted toward a darker motive, one that may have nothing to do with money and everything to do with a personal or professional vendetta. The fact that the ransom note lacked proof of life has led many to fear that the suspect never intended to return Nancy, using the note merely as a smokescreen to buy time for a getaway. As the Pima County authorities continue to face blistering criticism for the lack of scene security, the legal community is already debating the evidentiary value of the items found on the porch. The defense will undoubtedly target the 24 to 48-hour window where the scene was released, arguing that any rocks, foliage, or blood droplets could have been moved or altered by the influx of journalists and delivery personnel. This nightmare for investigators means that the state's case must be built on the bedrock of the stranger DNA found deep within the residence areas where the public did not have access. The search for Nancy Guthrie has become a cautionary tale for modern law enforcement, highlighting the fragile balance between public transparency and the preservation of a pristine crime scene. Until a match is found in the genetic databases, the Guthrie porch stands as a silent monument to a struggle that was both witnessed by the neighborhood's gravel and ignored by its security, leaving a family to wait in a silence that grows more deafening with every passing hour.